Hello everyone, welcome to this GCSE History revision video on the Elizabethans 1580 to 1603. This video is going to focus on Catholics, the nature and extent of the Catholic threat in Elizabethan England. Okay, so in terms of the OCR GCSE syllabus, we're going to be learning about the enforcement of Elizabeth's religious settlement after 1580. We're going to talk about Catholic links abroad, including plots against Elizabeth and the Elizabethan spy network, and then we're going to learn about Mary Queen of Scots, the Armada and the war with Spain. Yes, so just a reminder about how you're going to be assessed for the Elizabethans exam. So for question 6, you'll be given an historical interpretation and you'll have to identify and explain one way in which the historian puts across a particular point of view. For 6B, you're asked to do some further research on one aspect of interpretation A. So you're going to decide what you're going to choose to investigate. So you're going to identify the area for research, write your own inquiry question linked to a second order concept and explain how that would help a historian to further understand. And then question 7 is about two different historical interpretations. You have to explain how far they differ and what might explain the difference between them. And then question 8 and 9, you've got a choice for this question. It's a 20-mark question, 4 key arguments. You're looking for that degree of balance and then finishing up with a conclusion, your clinching argument. So there's a really helpful visual for you here to think about the idea of the Elizabethan religious settlement, the visual of a roller coaster. And it's important to just understand the context of what was happening with religion in the 16th century. So Henry VIII changed the church from the Catholic to the Protestant church in the English Reformation. He was never really a true Protestant and Catholic ideas continued. Edward VI, however, brought more Protestant changes in, and then Mary I restored the Catholic church. Some Protestants were burned at the stake, giving her the name Bloody Mary. So what Elizabeth I did, England was divided over religion, so Elizabeth's religious settlement became known as the Middle Way. So it's Protestant, but with some allowances for Catholics. And we'll look at those in a little bit more detail. Now, the threat of Catholic plots after 1568 led to Elizabeth gradually passing harsher anti-Catholic laws, particularly after 1580. And then to complete the story, after Elizabeth, James I, who became king, was Protestant, and he still had a threat of Catholic plots with things like the Gunpowder Plot. So what was the Elizabethan religious settlement? Well, Elizabeth was brought up as a Protestant, so she rejected Catholic beliefs like transubstantiation. She wasn't a religious radical either. She liked church music. She wanted a middle way to create order and stability within England during her rule. Now, in terms of who should be head of the church, Catholics believed the Pope should be head of the church. Protestants did not accept the authority of the Pope. They wanted the monarch to be head of the church, and Puritans didn't want anyone to be head of the church. So in the Elizabethan religious settlement, Elizabeth was declared to be the supreme governor of the church in England, and not using the title of head of the Church of England was a compromise to the Catholics. In terms of what churches should look like, Catholics wanted beautiful churches with stained glass windows and statues. Protestants wanted churches to be plain and simple, and Puritans wanted very simple churches, no stained glass windows and plain tables instead of altars. Now, Elizabeth kept decoration and ornaments in the churches, such as candlesticks on the altar, and that upset Puritans, but it did keep Catholics happy. Should the Bible and church services be in Latin or English? Well, Catholics wanted them in Latin, Protestants wanted them in English, and Puritans wanted them in English as well, and they wanted the minister to be dressed in plain black robes. Now, in the Act of Uniformity of 1559, Elizabeth's religious settlement said that all worship should be the same. Everyone should follow the same Book of Common Prayer in English, and the priests wore religious robes, and the priests actually wore Catholic vestments, and that was again another compromise towards the Catholics. So just to reinforce the Elizabethan religious settlement for you, it's really important foundational knowledge this. Elizabeth sought that compromise. There's that key idea of the middle way. She wanted a compromise between Catholics and Protestants by creating a religious settlement that was Protestant but would keep Catholics maybe not happy particularly, but on side. So she wanted people to outwardly conform, and one of the things she said is she didn't want to see windows into men's souls. So what that meant is that if you were sort of secretly as a Catholic loyal to the Pope, as long as you didn't go on about that, then that was going to be okay. So in terms of the Act of Supremacy, it re-established the break with Rome and an independent Church of England, and Elizabeth chose the title Supreme Governor, not Supreme Head, to appease the Catholics. In terms of the Act of Uniformity, going to church was compulsory, and there were fines for missing a church service, but they were relatively small fines at the start of her rule. A new Book of Common Prayer was issued to be used in all church services. Parishes had to have a copy of the Bible in English. Wording of the communion service was kept vague, so it was acceptable to Catholics and Protestants, and churches were allowed to keep some decorations, and priests had to wear Catholic vestments, which are the robes. So it was a middle way between the sort of Catholics, those ideas, and the Protestants. Obviously, it's a Protestant settlement, but there are things to keep the Catholics happy. Now, eventually, this would make Catholics unhappy, but also Puritans unhappy later on in her rule as well. But that's what we mean by the Elizabethan religious settlement. Okay, so how did people respond to the Elizabethan religious settlement? Well, there were basically four main reactions to the Elizabethan religious settlement. Most Catholics showed loyalty and attended church services. Few could afford the fines for non-attendance, and as Elizabeth did not seek windows into men's souls, people were happy to outwardly conform. So one of the responses was to be a conformer. So many Catholics went along with the changes and became Protestants. They simply abandoned their Catholic ideas and became Protestant. And they were persuaded to conform, having listened to the sermons, listening to priests. They were no longer fined for being Catholic, and those conformers were mainly to be found in the south and the east. There were also church papists who were inwardly loyal to the Pope, but still outwardly tended to conform. So most English Catholics, and that's especially in the north and west, attended Protestant services but kept their loyalty to the Pope. Going to church stopped them paying fines, but they did not change their beliefs. Elizabeth was okay with that. Now, many of these church papists hoped Catholicism would return with Mary Queen of Scots, but equally they were loyal to Elizabeth as the rightful monarch. Then there were reticents. People refused to go to church, so several thousand wealthy Catholic families, mainly based in the north and west, and they refused to attend church services, and they continued to hear or attend Mass. They could afford to pay the fines and hoped Catholicism would return with Mary Queen of Scots. Now, a very tiny minority of people, plotters, actually actively plotted against Elizabeth to bring about this religious change. And this was probably fewer than 200 people, and these people were fiercely loyal to the Pope. And they believed that opposition to Elizabeth was justified as it was God's will to remove her. So they were potentially treasonous. And this is the people that's sometimes referred to as the dangerous people in Elizabeth's rule. People responsible for things like the Throckmorton plot in 1583 and the Babington plot in 1586. So that's the main reactions to Elizabeth's religious settlement. Okay, now one of the things to be aware of is why does recusancy, which is the refusal to attend church on a Sunday, attend a Protestant church on a Sunday, become more common after 1580? And there's no doubt that it does. So refusing to attend church services becomes much more common. And that's after 1580, Catholics fight harder to keep the faith alive. Now, the main reasons for this are the following. A big cause of this is Mary Queen of Scots, who had arrived in England in 1568. Now, her presence is a huge problem for Elizabeth, and she becomes a magnet for Catholicism, including Catholic plots. And that's because Mary Queen of Scots, being the cousin of Elizabeth, is an heir to the throne. And as Mary Queen of Scots is a Catholic, it means that had Elizabeth died, Mary Queen of Scots would become queen. And therefore that galvanises Catholic opposition and Catholic plotters. Remember, there's not many of them, but some Catholic plotters to think if they could kill Elizabeth or get rid of Elizabeth, they could put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. So Mary Queen of Scots' arrival in England in 1568 galvanises the Catholic opposition. It leads to the Catholic Church making a much more organised effort to rebuild the Catholic faith in England. Elizabeth was excommunicated by the Pope in 1570, which meant her subjects did not have to remain loyal to her, and that was a turning point in how Catholics reacted. Catholic missionaries and priests were trained in England to keep the faith alive, and after 1580, more Catholics began to disobey the rules and refused to attend church. As we see there in 1580, Pope Gregory XIII said it wasn't a sin for a Catholic to kill Elizabeth, and that led to more concerns about plots. Now, especially richer families began to disobey the rules and refuse to attend church because they could afford the fines, and the fines were increased massively after 1580. We saw some Catholic plots during this time, the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot and the Babington plot, and these were seen as a serious threat by Elizabeth's government. So a little knowledge check there about why there is an increase in recusancy during this time. Thomas Tresham is also a really good case study in the increase in recusancy. So he's definitely somebody that was kind of inspired to increase his sort of Catholic opposition. But Thomas Tresham's also a really good example that he never plotted to get rid of Elizabeth, but he obviously is very dedicated to his Catholic faith, and he ends up losing all his property and money as a result of his Catholic faith. Okay, so one of the things the government does is respond with harsher and harsher laws to punish recusants during this time. So, in 1581, the Act of Persuasions raised recusancy fines by 10,000% to £20 a month. Only the very wealthiest could afford to pay, so this was a huge change. The 1584 Bond of Association said anyone who benefited from Elizabeth's death would be punished along with the murderers. And this was brought in as a direct result of the 1583 Throckmorton plot, and really was very much in mind the idea that Mary Queen of Scots would have benefited from such a plot. The 1585 Act against priests. Priests were seen as the heart of Catholic resistance. Jesuit priests, seminary priests, we'll look at them in a bit more in a moment. So those who offered shelter or aid to priests could face the death penalty. You probably remember that priests were often hidden in the homes of wealthy Catholics in so-called priest holes. Margaret Clitherow in 1586 became the first female Catholic martyr, someone who dies for their beliefs. She died having been tortured, pressed, with weights put on her own front door in York in 1586. The 1587 Recusancy Act, 2/3 of land owned by a recusant could be taken. Even wealthy Catholics like Thomas Tresson were by that stage forced into debt. There was a peak in executions and arrests of Catholics in 1588 due to fears of the Spanish Armada. 11 Catholics were executed in that year. And the 1593 Act restraining recusants. Catholics had to remain within 5 miles of their homes and not hold large gatherings. And the idea of that was to stop Catholic plots and make Catholics more isolated. So just a bit of a case study here of Margaret Clitherow, who lived from 1556 to 1586. She's a good example of how torture and execution increased against Catholics. Elizabeth ordered the execution of at least 200 Catholics during her reign. She was a butcher's wife from York, accused of sheltering priests in 1586. She refused to plead guilty or not guilty to an accusation that she'd sheltered a Catholic priest and gone against the Act against priests. Her captors stretched her out, placed a large sharp stone underneath her, and a door was placed over her body, and heavy weights were added in order to press her and crush her to death. So that shows you some of the brutality of Elizabeth's actions during her rule. So, seminary priests and Jesuit priests were sent to England to keep the Catholic faith alive from 1580. So Jesuit priests were specially trained to persuade people to become Catholics or deepen their Catholic faith. So examples of that are Robert Parsons or Robert Persons and Edmund Campion. Seminary priests were young English Catholics who were trained abroad. William Allen is an example of someone who ran 2 seminaries, and they were trained to support Catholics but not to try to convert existing Protestants. Now this is because in 1558 most English Catholic priests had become exiles and worked in Catholic countries within Europe. When the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570, there weren't Catholic priests in England to encourage her subjects to break laws. By the 1580s, the presence of Jesuit priests and seminary priests threatened her religious settlement. Okay, so some of the laws against priests meant that it was pretty dangerous to be a priest in Elizabeth's England. By 1580, 100 priests had arrived from Europe, and their mission was really dangerous. 2 seminary priests had been executed for treason in 1577. So wealthy Catholics made hiding places in their homes called priest holes, and the most famous designer of priest holes was a man called Nicholas Owen. Now, these seminary priests influenced many wealthy people to remain Catholic and encouraged people to be Catholic in their beliefs. Francis Walsingham, however, built up a large network of spies and informers to learn about plans, plots and the movement of Catholic priests. And this was a really sophisticated spy network, enabling them to track down many of these priests. Local justices of the peace were also ordered to search for priests in the houses of the gentry. Now, a good example of what happened to some of these priests is what happened to Edmund Campion. Now, Edmund Campion was smuggled into England in June 1580, and a pamphlet he wrote was printed and distributed by Catholics in August 1580. Now, Campion travelled in disguise between gentry houses, but he was captured in July 1581 by George Eliot, who's an example of a spy and priest catcher, sometimes known as a poursuivant, who took 2 days to find him. Now, Campion was tortured on the rack, revealing the names of other Catholics who'd helped him out. He was found guilty of treason, and that's really crucial. Not found guilty of being a heretic, but found guilty of treason. So the crime that he was making was basically to destabilise Elizabeth's rule. And he was sentenced to death in November 1581, and again he was executed as someone who committed treason. So he had the punishment of being hung, drawn and quartered, rather than being burnt at the stake, which would have been the punishment for a religious heretic. So this was a real turning point in how priests were treated during this time. So after the execution of Campion, Catholics published propaganda images of torture to expose the cruelty of Elizabeth's regime. Elizabeth's government used pamphlets and propaganda to justify what they were doing to Catholics. After 1585, priests on trial were asked the so-called bloody question about who they would be loyal to in the event of an invasion of England by, say, Spain, for example. The execution of priests peaked when England was under threat from the Spanish Armada, and during 1588, 11 lay Catholics were executed. So after 1588, the sort of threat of Catholic opposition faded, and many of these laws that Elizabeth had brought in had been really successful in reducing the Catholic threat. The Catholics had concentrated on the southeast, but reticency was actually strongest in the northwest, so the closer to London, the more Protestant people tended to be. Walsingham's spy network was more extensive than the Catholic network, and it was really effective in uncovering Catholic plots and threats. The Catholics had concentrated on the gentry, yet the majority of people in England were from the lower classes. The poor had no one to encourage them to stay Catholic, and of course it was very difficult to stay Catholic as a poor person because you wouldn't be able to afford any of the fines. Seminary and Jesuit priests also argued over tactics. The Pope appointed an archpriest, and the two groups argued about him. They were too divided to mount an effective opposition. So that's why the Catholic threat really began to fail. Okay, so let's have a look at Mary Queen of Scots in a bit more detail. Now, Mary Queen of Scots had a claim to the throne by what was known as the Stuart claim, which was through Henry VIII's older sister, Margaret. And you can see there where the relationship is between Elizabeth. And of course, when Elizabeth dies, it's actually Mary Queen of Scots' son, James VI of Scotland, who becomes the King of England, James I. Now, the historian Simon Sharma says Mary had become maximum security threat number one, not just a headache, but a magnet for conspiracy. Now, Mary Queen of Scots arrives in England in 1568, and that's her impact. Being a Catholic and also the heir to the throne, not that Elizabeth ever really named a successor, means that she presents a Catholic threat to Elizabeth. So let's find out about this in more detail. So in May 1568, Mary arrived by fishing boat at Workington, Cumbria, and this was bad news for Elizabeth. Mary Queen of Scots was Catholic, pro-French and a potential heir, and some even regarded Mary as the rightful Queen of England. Now, Elizabeth was concerned that Mary could act as a focus or a magnet for Catholic resistance and opposition in England. So Mary is kept under house arrest at Carlisle Castle and Bolton Castle. She's kept in isolated northern locations away from the sea to limit her threat. However, her presence in England would inspire a series of plots. Now, it's important to know that throughout her time in England, Mary Queen of Scots is kept in captivity for the full 19 years, and she never actually meets Elizabeth personally. However, her presence in England inspires a series of plots and rebellions. It inspires the 1569 Northern Rebellion, led by the Duke of Norfolk, the Ridolfi Plot of 1571, the Throckmorton Plot of 1583, the Babington Plot of 1586, and all this leads to the eventual execution of Mary Queen of Scots in February 1587. So why was Mary Queen of Scots a threat? Well, Mary was the rightful and crowned Queen of Scotland. She'd been forced to flee from Scotland by Scottish nobles, which might encourage rebellion against Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was always torn between whether she should help Mary Queen of Scots as her so-called sister queen, or whether Mary was actually a real threat to her. Now, the Privy Council, Elizabeth's Privy Council, wanted Mary investigated over the suspicious death of Lord Darnley, one of her husbands, in 1567. Parliament did not trust Mary and believed Mary should be executed. Now, William Cecil is really key in this. He's very, very distrustful of Mary Queen of Scots and sees Mary as a real threat to the stability of England. Mary had links to France and also to Spain by being Catholic, and she could cause trouble from these two powerful European countries. Mary had the strongest claim to the throne. If she became queen, she would revert England to being a Catholic country. Scotland was a Protestant country, so if Mary returned to Scotland, it could start a civil war, so it would be difficult for Mary to ever return to Scotland. Mary's arrival gave Catholics hope that they could restore Catholicism to England. So as we've seen, Elizabeth kept Mary locked up in various northern castles in England between 1568 and 1587. Leaving Mary free would be dangerous. Helping her win back the Scottish throne would be too costly, and executing her could store up more rebellion and potential invasion from France and Spain. Now, there's just a reminder of these main different plots that happened during this time: the Northern Rebellion, the Ridolfi Plot, the Throckmorton Plot, and the Babington Plot. Now, the Northern Rebellion was a rebellion in the north. Involved the Duke of Norfolk, who planned to marry Mary Queen of Scots and set her up as heir to the throne. 10,000 soldiers were sent north to end the rebellion. The Ridolfi Plot was basically an Italian banker who passed messages to the Pope and Philip II of Spain. Mary and the Duke of Norfolk wanted the Pope and Spain to join forces to invade England and overthrow Elizabeth. After that Ridolfi plot, MPs demanded that Mary should be executed, and one MP called Mary the monstrous and huge dragon, the Queen of Scots. Now, in the time period of this course, the Throckmorton plot planned an uprising of English Catholic nobles to free Mary, make her queen, and restore Catholicism. The invasion force led by the French Duke of Guise would be supported by Spain and the Pope. Now, Walsingham wanted to prove Mary's guilt, but he couldn't find enough evidence in order to make her guilty, and that's one of the kind of key reasons why we had the Bond of Association passed in 1584. The Babington plot is what was the final nail in the coffin for Mary. Babington carried secret letters for Mary. The plan was to invade England, kill Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. The threat invasion was very real, as England was already at war with Spain, and this led to Mary's eventual execution. Walsingham had clear evidence Mary plotted to execute Elizabeth. He and Lord Burleigh, William Cecil, demanded that she be executed. So Mary Queen of Scots was executed after she'd used coded messages as part of the Babington plot. The communication was intercepted by Walsingham's spies. It shows the great spy network they had. She was put on trial, found guilty of treason, and executed at Fotheringay Castle on the 8th of February 1587. Now, Elizabeth had been unsure on whether to sign Elizabeth's death warrant. She ummed and ahed about it, but she eventually signed it, but asked for it not to be sealed. William Cecil sensed his opportunity. He sealed the death warrant and sent it to Fotheringay Castle, leading to Mary's execution. Elizabeth would claim afterwards that she was furious about this, and then it had gone ahead, and she refused to speak to William Cecil for months afterwards. But this may well have been a ruse for her to pretend to be upset about it, but in reality the execution of Mary Queen of Scots was actually pretty fortuitous for Elizabeth. Okay, so we're just going to look at the background to Anglo-Spanish hostility before the Spanish Armada of 1588. So when Elizabeth became Queen, she rejected an offer of marriage from King Philip II of Spain. Philip was a Catholic. He viewed the Queen as a heretic and wanted to restore Catholicism to England. Now, in the 1570s, Elizabeth had supported privateers who attacked Spanish treasure ships in the New World, such as John Hawkins and Francis Drake. King Philip II had supported the Throckmorton plot to depose Elizabeth, and then in 1584 the Dutch rebel leader William of Orange was assassinated by a Catholic subject of Philip II, and Elizabeth feared this could happen to her. In 1585, Elizabeth sent an army under the command of Robert Dudley to help Dutch rebels fight against Spanish rule. And in 1587, Philip prepared a fleet of ships, the Armada, to invade England. And when Mary Queen of Scots was executed, Philip was even more determined to succeed in his crusade against England. So just a timeline there of some of the key events. Now, it's just worth looking at Spain. Spain had a huge empire within South America, which is a great source of wealth. In the 1570s, English sailors such as Drake and John Hawkins began to raid Spanish treasure ships, and we know that Francis Drake had circumnavigated the world between 1577 and 1580 and had raided Spanish gold and Spanish treasure ships during that time then as well within South America. So what caused the war with Spain? Well, by 1580, England was Protestant, but Europe's two great powers, France and Spain, were Catholic. Now, France was internally divided, but Spain was a serious threat to English power and the Protestant religion. This is because Elizabeth refused to marry Philip II of Spain when she became queen. In the 1570s, English sailors like Francis Drake acted like pirates, attacking Spanish ports in America. The Spanish referred to Francis Drake as El Draque, the dragon. Spain ruled the Netherlands, and Philip II was angry when Elizabeth sent money and eventually soldiers to support the Protestant Dutch rebels there in the 1570s. Now, Philip II was also a devout Catholic, so when the Pope declared in 1580 it wasn't a sin to kill Elizabeth, Philip supported plots against Elizabeth so Mary Queen of Scots could become queen. Now, this image presents the Netherlands as a cow with Philip II riding it and a Spanish commander milking the cow. Elizabeth is shown to be feeding the cow, a symbol of the money and weapons she unofficially gave the Netherlands. So this is some of the long-term factors of the war with Spain. So the Anglo-Spanish War actually began in 1584. So a Catholic subject, Philip II, killed the leader of the Dutch Protestant rebels, William of Orange. Now, Elizabeth was shocked as this assassination showed the same could happen to her. And after this murder, Elizabeth's advisors finally persuaded her to send an army to help the Dutch. In 1585, Elizabeth signed a treaty with the Dutch rebels and sent the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, with 7,000 men to fight the Spanish in the Netherlands, meaning England and Spain were at war. Leicester led the troops badly, but they did stop the Spanish. Francis Drake sailed to the West Indies to attack Spanish ports returning with gold. So the trigger caused the assassination of the leader of the Dutch Protestant rebels, Prince William of Orange, and this historical interpretation shows William of Orange being shot dead by Balthasar Gerard. So Philip II decided to launch a crusade by sending a Catholic army to invade England and defeat the Protestant heretics as he saw it. So he started to build an armada, a fleet of ships, and planned to sail it from Spain to the Netherlands and collect 20,000 troops led by the Duke of Parma. Now, the Armada was actually supposed to sail in 1587, but a surprise attack by Francis Drake on the Spanish port of Cadiz damaged many of the Armada ships and delayed their sailing by months. This is an event sometimes known as the singeing of the King's beard. Mary Queen of Scots was executed in the same year, in 1587, and by July 1588, the Armada would be ready to sail. So in 1588, in England, the government's campaign to catch Catholic priests was at its height, and more recusants than ever were being rounded up and imprisoned. The government was determined to prevent a Catholic uprising in support of the invading Spanish army. Okay, so when the Armada launched, Philip put the Duke of Medina Sidonia in charge, and he had very little experience of sailing, and he wasn't a navy commander. He was much more used to fighting on land. When the Armada of 130 ships arrived at the English Channel, it was chased by English ships but still waited at Calais for the Duke of Parma's army from the Netherlands. Dutch ships blocked the army from joining up with the Armada. The English then set fire to old ships and let them drift into the Armada as fire ships. As a result, the Spanish panicked, cut their anchors and sailed north. A battle took place off the coast of Belgium. The Spanish guns were unreliable and one Spanish ship sank, resulting in 1,000 Spanish men dying and 50 Englishmen killed. The Armada was then driven north by the winds, so had to go around Scotland to sail home, but powerful storms wrecked about 44 Spanish ships off Scotland and Ireland, and eventually around 80 returned to Spain. So why did the Spanish Armada fail? Well, firstly, the English had strength. They'd improved their shipbuilding and given them several advantages. Spain relied on large ships which were heavy and difficult to handle, whereas the English built long, narrow ships which were faster, easier to handle, easier to manoeuvre. English cannons could be reloaded a lot more quickly than Spanish ones. The English tactics were more effective. The Spanish ships had aimed to get close board vessels and overcome the enemy in hand-to-hand fighting. The Spanish couldn't use this tactic against the English. He used their great mobility to stay out of range of the Spanish. Instead of boarding the Spanish ships, the English fired broadsides, which are massive barrages of cannonballs, which could sink them. There was a little bit of luck here. The death of Spain's leading admiral, Santa Cruz, led to the appointment of the inexperienced Duke of Medina Sidonia, who was never supposed to lead the Armada. The weather made it impossible for the Spanish fleet to return to the Channel after the Battle of Gravelines, forcing it to travel into dangerous waters off the Scottish and Irish coasts. The Spanish were weak as well. Most of Spain's men lacked experience of naval warfare, whereas the English fleet was manned by experienced sailors. The Spanish plan to meet the Duke of Parma at Dunkirk was seriously flawed. Spain didn't control a deep water port where the Armada could safely anchor, so the ships were extremely vulnerable to an attack while they waited for Parma's troops to escape the Dutch blockade. So some conclusions there on why the Spanish Armada was defeated. A little bit of luck, but also there's the technological and tactical superiority of the English. The Spanish didn't do themselves any favours either. The Armada strategy was flawed, but Philip II made the situation worse by sending the wrong men, including the wrong leaders, to carry it out. So the defeat of the Spanish Armada reduced but did not end the Spanish Catholic threat. In 1589, Francis Drake led an English armada to attack Portugal and stir the Portuguese to revolt against Spain, but it failed. He later died at sea in 1595 when attempting to raid Spanish ports in America. In 1594, the Netherlands were a secure Protestant area by this point and virtually independent from Spain. In 1596, England formed an alliance with France and Protestant Netherlands against Spain. The Earl of Essex led a successful raid on the Spanish port of Cadiz later that year. In 1596 and 97, Philip II sent two further armadas, which were both wrecked by storms. Then in 1601, the Spanish landed in Ireland to support a rebellion by the Earl of Tyrone, but they were defeated by 1603. In 1604, the Treaty of London ended the war with Spain 1 year after Elizabeth's death. So in terms of the big question about why there's so few Catholics, well, the defeat of the Spanish Armada was crucial in reducing the sort of Catholic threat from Spain, but it didn't end the Catholic threat from Spain. But Philip II was never able to launch another attack like it. Throughout the 1590s, the Netherlands became securely Protestant and England formed an alliance with France, reducing Spain's threat. Okay, so that completes that key question. There were very few Catholics in Elizabeth's kingdom by 1603, and that's because the harsh laws she brought in helped to restrict them, in particular restrict the Jesuit priests and the seminary priests. She was able to deal successfully with the threat of Mary Queen of Scots, and the internal opposition that created. The effective spy network that Walsingham had meant that he could track down plots, and ultimately the defeat of the Spanish Armada reduced the international Catholic threat as well. Thanks very much for listening. Bye bye.